it's not a very expensive add-on either. You're talking under $200 to get a decent one for your system that's going to be able to run it for a decent amount of time. So, um, anybody's watching this, if you have any care, if your footage matters to you, get a UPS. Like,
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of In the Trenches Roundtable. Today, we're going to be focusing on a specific product, UPS battery backups. As always, we have our fantastic panel with us. Say hi.
Hi guys.
hey,
Hey everybody.
Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna break down today's video by starting with what exactly is a UPS or a battery backup, who should be interested in it, and how do you calculate run times? In other words, how do you know what kind of battery backup to use? So let's start with what is a UPS?
the delivery service. No,
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
package delivery company.
Yeah, they've
Where's
been around for
Brown?
a while now. So UPS stands for Uninterruptible Power Supply. Am I correct on that? Now that I think of it.
Yes, I think you
Yeah.
are.
Yes.
So, and what basically in layman's term, what that really means is it's just a battery backup. So, in the event that you lose power, the NVR in kind of our case or the other security equipment doesn't go and power off on you. So, that's really important, especially in the event of brownouts. And I'll let somebody else explain what brownouts is, but those can be really damaging to a computer system, security camera system, whatever else you potentially have there.
Could someone clarify what is a brownout? What do we mean by that?
So I think the best way to explain what a brownout is to contrast it with a blackout. Blackout, like suddenly you're out of power. Brownout is the voltage drop. So it
Mm.
results in a lot of the same thing. A lot of your electronics will restart. It'll get interrupted. It may power on repeatedly. Um, but brownout is caused by a bunch of different things, like too many people trying to use too much electricity at the same time, or a disruption from like a storm, something like that, that is causing less power than everybody's trying to use to suddenly occur.
Why should I be concerned with an NVR or with an NVR turning on and off again? Because it sounds like this is brownout is a situation where it's very short term. Turning things on and off again is how you fixed most things in tech support, right, Michael? So why should I be bothered by this?
Well, whenever you restart a piece of electronic equipment, manually, you did it. The
Hmm.
power just didn't drop. It goes through a certain process to pretty much protect itself and shut it down properly, and then come back
Mm.
online. Whenever you have a piece of technology that you just remove power from immediately, over and over and over again, you can get all kinds of weird issues pop up, and you can even
Okay, so it's
you
the difference between jerking the plug out from the back of the device and pressing and holding the power button and letting it do a graceful shutdown.
exactly, and there might be a little bit more coming along with that brownout. Maybe there's a little bit of a power surge that's coming after your electronics that you don't even realize.
Are UPSs typically also surge protectors, or is that typically a separate device?
From what I understand, yes. At least the ones that
Yeah.
I have and the ones that SCW carries, they are also surge protectors as well as a UPS.
Yeah, and to hit a little bit on why the brownouts are so dangerous when it comes to the NVR, especially is because NVRs are constantly writing to the hard drive, whether there's
Mm.
any activity or not, it's recording, and whether you've got it on motion or not, it's recording to that hard drive. And when you just kind of plug power out or unplug it without going through what's known as a graceful shutdown, you're in a situation where that data doesn't have time to like finish writing and do it in a way that allows it to shut down without corrupting your data. And so
Yep.
what can happen in these brownout scenarios is, it turns off and it just messed up the hard drive because it was writing to it. And then you turn it back on and it's trying to boot up again. And just when it gets to boot, it turns off again because you have another power outage or in a storm or something like that. If you're in an area that has a lot of lightning or just you've been in storms in general, it's not always just a clean shut off. It's usually on, off, on, off, on, off, and that's sort of what we're describing. And that just brings the likelihood of corruption much more high. So you can lose your footage, you can lose your settings on the NVR. It could even get to the point where the NVR's boot thing is, kind of corrupt, or even, and this goes to any electronic too, computers, um, access control equipment,
Your
etc.
routers, your
They all
switches.
are vulnerable to something like that.
So what happens when the UPS runs out of power? Aren't you essentially back where you started as far as loss of electricity?
A little bit, and that's kind of where, the UPS doesn't necessarily do a graceful shutdown with most NVR systems, like it can with a computer and stuff that you get software on and stuff like that. But the UPS is there to prevent, having one power loss like that is not obviously a good thing. You don't want to do that, but it's much less of a risk than those brownouts we kind of mentioned. And then the other point of the UPS is it does give you hopefully enough time to get to the NVR and actually gracefully shut it down itself. So that way you
Mm.
don't have to lose power like a crash kind of scenario. So
Yeah, and there's always the case that your business or your home might be running off of a power grid that is not completely up to date. It can be called dirty power, and this
Yeah.
can help, give you clean power to your electronics, not just your
Hmm.
NVR. Any major electronic that is in your home or your business, this is a benefit.
And by
Absolutely.
dirty power, we mean sort of that fluctuation in voltage. Instead of it being steady and consistent, you're seeing it go up and down. There's a certain
Yep.
amount of that a device can handle, and there's a certain amount of that will damage it over time. You've
Mhm.
kind of transitioned us a little bit into this next topic by mentioning, sort of the regional differences. Like who should be interested in a UPS? Who are the folks that you would say, yes, absolutely, you really seriously need to consider this versus folks you'd say, maybe.
So as James said earlier, Florida, let's use that as an example as a region where you really want to focus on having something like this. South Florida is the lightning capital of the world.
Mhm.
So the amount of lightning that you get there is 10 to 10,000 times greater than other locations. You absolutely want to have something like that. I made a
Along
joke
with
about it
surge
earlier.
protection, which we have
Yeah,
another video on.
yes. If you've got power fluctuations that are common in your grid, or you have lightning that's common in your geographic location, these are really good places to have. The other really big one that we should be considering is if you use RAID. The way that RAID saves data means that you could not just corrupt a file, but an entire drive if you have an issue with this. So if you are using RAID, again, we've got another video for that, comment in below on where to find that. But if you are using RAID, which is a redundant array of disks that allows you to store the footage in multiple places and have a backup, if you're using that, you really need to make sure that you have a UPS, because you can not, instead of corrupting a individual file that may be 3 minutes long of surveillance footage, you might corrupt an entire hard drive.
So what I'm hearing is basically anybody who's in a building, maybe an older building, where you're concerned that the power is dirty, is not very consistent. Areas that are really prone to lightning storms and loss of power connected with that, and any client who's using RAID is will particularly benefit from that added protection. Is there anybody
Absolutely.
else who should just really seriously consider adding this to their system?
I did. It's
yeah,
important. I have. I'm sorry, I'm a techie type of person. I'm in tech support. I have big electronics in my home. I want them to be protected. I also have a whole home generator that will kick on. Usually it takes about a minute for it to start running, but my battery backups will keep everything up and running until my generator starts giving power to the entire house.
Mm.
So not only am I getting clean power, but it gives me
You're
time.
bridging that transition.
Exactly. Rather than everything dropping and then going through brownouts, it
Hmm.
just gives it time for everything to come back online with the generator power versus the grid power.
It gives you enough time to get into your bunker so you can hunker down for the
Yeah.
nuclear holocaust. Cool.
Yes.
I would say too, like one that kind of came to mind is, we just talked about Florida and lightning storms. If you're up north too, and you get a lot of snow and everything like that, those brownouts are really common with like snow too, because it tends to like really, it gets on the lines, and
Mm.
you can be in that situation where those brownouts happen a lot too. But really just about anybody. I mean, I can't think of a reason why you wouldn't want to have some form of protection like this, because it's not a very expensive add-on either. You're talking under $200 to get a decent one for your system that's gonna be able to run it for a decent amount of time. So, um, anybody's watching this, if you have any care. If your footage matters to you, get a UPS. Like it's pretty much almost like I would almost consider like a necessity for most systems.
What should I look for in a UPS? Like, how do I make a choice?
Well, so that's a great question because there are a lot of different UPSs out there on the market, and typically it goes into number one sort of features. How many outlets do they have? That's one thing you might want to look at. Some of them are split between how many outlets are actually battery backup and how many of them are surge. So a lot of times you don't necessarily need everything. Like for example, you may not need your monitor / TV on the surge protector or the
Yep.
battery backup because that's going to use a lot of power, etc. But you want the NVR there. So you can kind of choose which ones you want there. But the big thing is really like down to the capacity. Every UPS is rated in what's known as either or both volt amps or wattage. And essentially the higher the wattage and volt amps, the more power you can put on it and the longer that system's going to run. And I'll let somebody else grab like the rest of that, but that's kind of the basics of it.
Okay, so how do you know how much wattage you need for your specific setup?
So I can actually help with this one. The wattage for all of our equipment is actually on the spec sheet of every device that we carry.
That's handy.
So yeah, it definitely is. But SCW support, the sales team, we're always happy to help you calculate exactly what it is you're getting. The larger systems, of course, are going to take a little bit more time. You might have to get multiple UPSs for your system, but I mean, honestly,
That's
if you
because
just have
you typically have other networking equipment you want to protect
Yep.
in that dynamic, switches
Yep.
and routers.
Exactly. And that way you keep everything up. That's another big thing. You might have a remote switch running 8 cameras that's feeding back into your network to get to your NVR. You got to have that powered up or that connection is going to break. But yeah, we can calculate the wattage of the NVR. We can calculate the wattage of each camera. We can calculate the wattage of even the hard drives. Remember there's an actual piece inside the NVR that you need to calculate for as well.
Why are you calculating the wattage of the cameras when they're not plugged into the UPS?
But they are plugged into the back of your NVR or maybe on a PoE switch. So we just have to take in that total amount of wattage
Because
from
the
every
switch and the
device.
NVR are powering the camera, so that's going to affect the amount of draw.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
And we always calculate the max wattage.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe during the day, your camera's not going to be using as much power because it's not in night mode, the infrared, or maybe even a white light isn't turned on. Maybe you have a PTZ that just kind of sits stationary until you actually move it. Those motors are actually going to, use a little bit more wattage. So we'll always calculate the max wattage for you. That way, kind of what you're building for your own UPS.
That makes sense. So we've talked about how UPSs are they function as this bridge, giving you enough time to do a graceful shutdown, keeping things from going offline when you have sort of this short loss of power. How much time do you typically want for that kind of a bridge?
Yeah, so a UPS, in terms of runtime, is going to vary based on the power you have plugged into it, the battery capacity, and the power capacity of that UPS. But to give you an example, our larger NVR offering right now has 450 watt capacity. And if you're running that at 100%, so that's all 450 watts there, that's going to give you about a 2-minute runtime. And so that should be enough for it to withstand any of those brownout style situations that we talked that are really dangerous, but then also be enough time for hopefully you to go and gracefully shut it down if you do know it's going to be like a longer outage or something like that. But then on the flip side of that, if you're running it at say 30% capacity, which would be like 130 watts or so, you're looking at about 16 minutes of runtime. So that's where that variation comes in. So, if you want kind of a longer runtime, you can look at larger backups and everything like that. But typically, to frame them in a way, runtimes are typically for UPSs are more so for short term under 15 minutes generally, and then usually get generators. But depending on the need and everything like that, you can get very large ones. You get ones that take up entire server racks that can last a couple hours and all that kind of stuff. It just depends on what you're willing to spend. Obviously, the more bigger capacity, the more money too. So
yeah, those large ones can get super expensive.
yeah. And it's
But
not
I'm
like,
hearing you say for most people, you don't really need that much time. This is a stopgap. It's not a permanent solution.
yeah, not a generator, like
It's not a
Michael
generator.
mentioned, you know.
Right.
Now that we've covered run times, how you select, which UPS you need and what is appropriate for your usage, that kind of wraps up our agenda today. Does anybody have any final thoughts about UPSs? Is that the correct plural of UPS?
That's a
UPSI.
good
Yes.
question, yeah. I'd just say, really consider using one. If you don't have one right now, or you're planning on a system, plan UPSs or backup power to be part of your solution there. It's part of the system, even if it is technically optional.
Well, thank you everybody for watching, and thank you to our panel for sharing your experiences and your expertise. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. Our website is getscw.com, or you can leave a comment below. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye, guys.